Sauron is the big bad of the Lord of the Rings, a being so powerful and terrifying that despite not even making a physical appearance, he's one of the most iconic villains of the fantasy genre. But what is he actually capable of at a physical level? How did he earn his position as the second Dark Lord of Middle-earth? In this video, we'll crawl through Tolkien's writings and find out exactly what Sauron's powers actually were. Sauron was mighty among the Maya, an order of angelic beings that were a tier beneath the Vala, who were basically godlike beings that operated underneath Iluvatar, the one true god and creator. The Maya had a vast array of powers. The specifics of these powers largely depended on what Vala they served. Sauron, originally known as Myron, served Aule in his early years, Aule being known as the Smith. As a result, Sauron's earliest powers related to craftsmanship and the ordering and shaping of things. However, Sauron was soon ensnared by Melkor, later known as Morgoth. He is often described as the mightiest of Morgoth's named servants. He was Morgoth's right-hand man, and was the one who took control of the war effort if Morgoth was ever absent for one reason or another. Perhaps the most iconic description of Sauron is this, found in the Silmarillion. Sauron was become now a sorcerer of dreadful power, master of shadows and of phantoms, foul in wisdom, cruel in strength, mishapping what he touched, twisting what he ruled, lord of werewolves, his dominion was torment. Now this statement is rather vague. It no doubt paints Sauron as a powerful, terrifying figure, but it doesn't really get into the specifics of what he is actually capable of. What magic does Sauron use, and in what ways can he use that magic? Strap in, this is going to be a long ride. As one of the Maya, Sauron possessed powers that were only natural to the Ainur, but were the equivalent of magic to other races. One such power was telepathy, an ability that all of the Ainur possessed due to them not necessarily needing bodies to communicate. In that sense, Sauron could communicate in thoughts to other creatures that had the ability to interpret those messages. He also had the ability to read the minds of those whose thoughts were not closed to him, an experience that Pippin claimed was incredibly painful. Other magics that were natural to the Ainur came in the form of songs of power and words of command, although we're not exactly sure how this magic worked. We never see Sauron use a word of command, but given Durin's Bane and Gandalf both use one during their struggle in Moria, it can be reasonably assumed Sauron could use them as well. However, we do see Sauron use a song of power against Finrod Felagund. Finrod counters with one of his own, but Sauron is victorious and uses it to overwhelm Finrod, strip him of his disguise, and imprison him. Just FYI, the Song of Power sequence in the Silmarillion is amazing, and if you haven't read it before, you totally should. As one might expect, Sauron had incredible powers in relation to crafting and building. The Rings of Power, powerful artifacts that could be used in a number of different ways, were all crafted with Sauron's direct help, or at least with the knowledge he had given. The One Ring itself was also a work of genius. It was essentially a mind control device. Its original purpose was to dominate all other ring bearers regardless of their location. The Rings of Power are not the only examples of Sauron's powers of craftsmanship. Barad-dûr, Sauron's main fortress, was so impossibly large that it was only held together by Sauron's power, and upon the destruction of the One Ring, it instantly began to crumble. Other lesser creations that were probably engineered by Sauron were the Watcher Stones, two pairs of statues that stood at the entrances of both Cirith Ungol and Minas Morgul. Fell spirits were bound to these statues, and they had the ability to see, send alarm, or even bar the way if an intruder's willpower was not strong enough. Sauron also had the power of manipulation over other works of craft. For example, when it came to the Palantiri, Sauron could not conjure false images, but he could pick and choose what he decided to reveal in them. He used this strategy to wear down the mind of Denethor, filling it with madness and despair that would eventually result in his death. It wasn't just works of craft where Sauron applied his expertise, he also applied it to biology. During his stint as Dark Lord, Sauron first created the Uruks, a race of improved orcs, and the Olokai, a race of improved trolls. Notably, both of these creations were capable of withstanding the sun, unlike other orcs and trolls. Sauron also seems to have created, or at least improved, the fell beasts that the Nazgûl used as mounts. Above all else, werewolves were perhaps Sauron's greatest creations. These were wolf-like creatures that were inhabited by fell spirits that Sauron had imprisoned. Speaking of fell spirits, one of Sauron's most well-known names was the Necromancer. He was the master of the dark arts, and had the ability to bind spirits to places or objects, an abominable practice he taught to many of his servants. Examples of this practice are the creation of beings such as the Barrow-wight or the aforementioned Watcher statues. He was able to summon madness or terror-inducing phantoms who, whilst often not real, could be dangerous all the same. A perfect example of this was when he ensnared Gorlim the Unhappy, creating a phantom of his dead wife to lure him into a trap. Through his practice of necromancy, Sauron corrupted many lands, Mirkwood, Tal Nu Fuin, and Tol Sirion to name a few. This corruption was a central part of Sauron's way of gaining dominion over new lands, and it was something that he could do incredibly quickly. In the not even 10 years Sauron had dominion over Tol Sirion and Dorthonion, he corrupted both lands so badly that they became places of fear and earned new names, Tol in Galahoth and Tal Nu Fuin. Sauron's presence in Dol Guldur also gradually corrupted the large forest of Greenwood, giving it the new name of Mirkwood, and by the end of the Third Age, most of the forest was the haunt of evil creatures. Other lands that suffered similar corruption thanks to Sauron or his direct servants included Angmar, the Trollshores, the Barrow Downs, the Dead Marshes, Minas Ithil, and of course Mordor itself. The exact process of this corruption is unknown, but Tolkien gives plenty of hints. In these lands, the trees would begin to grow black and grim, the roots would tangle and reach up from the ground like claws, dark enchantments would cause people to become lost and blind, and they would begin to have visions of nightmares and phantoms, which would drive them mad and often result in their deaths. As time passed, all living creatures that had not been ensnared by the shadow would flee the land, leaving it dead and lifeless, inhabited only by monsters and shadows. In many of these places, even Sauron's servants feared to tread. Once sufficiently corrupted, these lands would reveal another power in Sauron's arsenal, farsightedness. This is where the iconography of the lidless eye comes from, in that Sauron, never sleeping, eternally vigilant, could see all of the comings and goings in his land. When he corrupted Tol Sirion, it was stated that no living being could pass through the Vale of Sirion without Sauron being aware of their presence. However, these powers had limits. As proven by Frodo and Sam sneaking into Mordor, Sauron could not see everything provided his attention was sufficiently fixated on something else. In Mordor, Sauron also seems to demonstrate a level of control over the natural environment, especially over Mount Doom. In 3429 of the Second Age, Mount Doom erupts, and shortly afterwards, Sauron attacks Gondor, and in 2954 of the Third Age, only a few years after Sauron returned to Mordor, Mount Doom erupts, again after a long period of dormancy. Before his attack on Gondor during the War of the Ring, Sauron weaponizes the fumes from Mount Doom and uses them to block out the sun to provide his invading armies with cover. Sauron also seems to have had an affinity with fire, although it's uncertain how much he could control it. One of Sauron's other iconic powers was his ability to shapeshift. In his early years, Sauron could take many forms, and could change them at a moment's notice. When he is trying to escape Huan, he rapidly shifts from a werewolf to a serpent and then to a vampire bat. His ability to be terrifying or cunning was often tied to the form he was using at the time. The most well-known example of this was Anatar, Lord of Gifts, Sauron's fair form that he used to deceive the elves and Númenóreans. Unfortunately for Sauron, he lost the ability to shapeshift when he was physically killed during the downfall of Númenor, and he was trapped in the body of a Dark Lord, horrifying to look upon from that point onwards. One thing that is often associated with Sauron is terror, and this isn't figurative, it's a very real thing. We're told that Sauron had an aura of terror around him, which had a number of different uses. For example, Sauron's presence alone is enough to scare Gorlim the Unhappy into revealing everything he knew about Barahir's band. Another example is that when Sauron attacks Huan, his aura of malice is enough to cause Luthien to pass out. And when Sauron attacks the island of Tol Sirion, the dark cloud of fear surrounding him is enough to cause the defenders of the island to flee in terror. However, Sauron has the ability to turn this off, so to speak. Although he can be terrifying, Sauron can assume a fair form and have the ability to be incredibly cunning. His words can have a seductive quality that goes far beyond what natural charisma can achieve. This is displayed when he convinces Celebrimbor and the Smiths of Eregion to accept his teachings. However, Sauron's cunning is best demonstrated in his corruption of Númenor. After he is captured by the Númenóreans, it does not take long before many of the Númenóreans in his presence begin to warm to his words. After 3 years, even the strong-willed Ar-Pharazôn has been ensnared, and after 50 years, most Númenóreans have fully accepted Sauron's teachings. It should also be noted that Sauron's power of seduction does not require his fair form or a hidden identity to deceive people either. Throughout the Third Age, Sauron no longer had the guise of a fair form, but still ends up corrupting most of the men on Middle-earth into serving him. He also manages to ensnare Saruman, despite Saruman knowing full well who Sauron is and the danger that he poses. Speaking of the Third Age, during these years, Sauron took a step back and became less personally involved with matters that concerned him, preferring to use his servants such as the Nazgûl. However, Sauron's strength did not remain wholly at Barad-dûr, and the strength of his will often empowered his servants during their activities abroad. In fact, it was the power of Sauron's will that kept his whole operation afloat, and it drove his servants to lengths that they otherwise would not have dared to go. The importance of Sauron's will is demonstrated when the One Ring is destroyed, and Sauron rendered impotent. Without his will, his forces rapidly disintegrated and no longer posed a threat. And finally, let's talk Sauron's physical power. I've made the joke a few times on this channel that Sauron wasn't much of a fighter, and while I believe that is true in relation to the class of being that Sauron was, he was still a daunting foe all the same, especially to lesser beings. In his Dark Lord form, although not gigantic, he was still far taller than the average man, far stronger, and far more difficult to kill. In Númenor, whilst not even in his Dark Lord form, he was struck by lightning and stood unharmed. It required two of the greatest heroes of the Second Age, Elendil and Gil-galad, to bring him down, and he killed both of them in the process. Gil-galad died in a particularly gruesome fashion, being burned to death by the heat of Sauron's hand. So to summarise, Sauron is quite a versatile villain. He had all the powers that were natural to the Ainur: telepathy, mind reading, words of command, songs of power. He was a brilliant craftsman and builder, capable of empowering items to great degrees. He was a master of the dark arts, capable of summoning and binding the spirits of the dead, and creating terrible and maddening illusions and phantoms. He was able to improve upon the creatures that Morgoth had created, removing their weaknesses and enhancing their strengths. He was capable of corrupting the very land itself, rendering it hostile and lifeless. He was far-sighted, being able to observe distant events, and was usually aware of all that was happening in his lands. He demonstrated an ability to control the natural environment. He could cause volcanic eruptions and weaponize the fumes. Until the downfall of Númenor, he was able to shapeshift at will, taking on forms both fair and monstrous. He had a terrifying aura, capable of causing great and brave warriors to drop their weapons and run. He was also exceptionally cunning. His words could convince and ensnare those that were once his enemies. His will was enough to drive his armies onwards and fill them with the fear of failure. And finally, he was a Dark Lord. Perhaps not the mightiest in physical strength, but still daunting and difficult to kill all the same. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I hope this video has helped clarify some of Sauron's abilities, but I can also imagine some people are now confused about the whole words of power and song of command stuff, and honestly, I feel ya. In my Morgoth vs Sauron video, I had a lot of people saying that I displayed Sauron favoritism, and I want to remedy that, so soon I'll be doing a Morgoth's power video, whatever. Cheers, farewell, and remember, Sauron may have had many powers, but one thing he didn't have is the power of friendship.